Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Understanding Chess with Trenton. I am Trenton. Today we are going to look at what has been nicknamed the Game of the Century. It's a game played between Donald Byrne, who was a United States International Master, versus Bobby Fischer at the Rosenwald Tournament in 1956 in New York City. The reason that this game was nicknamed the Game of the Century is because Bobby Fischer at the time was only 13 years old, and this is sort of the game that made him famous. He'd only been invited to this tournament because he'd won the United States Junior Chess Championship and was kind of a token placement. And then in this game, he showed some really deep thinking and amazing combination play. And he kind of proved to the world what chess player he would become. Now, I'm going to skip through a little bit of the introduction of this game just because of time constraints. After move 5 with black, we'll get into the game here and focus on the middle game, which is the most interesting part. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the game afterwards. So hope you enjoy. The game has transposed into what is called the Grunfeld defense. Not going to go too much over that, only that the main idea behind black's whole defense against white is that he is doing what's called hypermodern principles. It was a new school of chess thought that came in the 1920s, where the traditional idea was that you always wanted both sides to build a strong classical pawn center. And then these guys like Aaron Nimzowitsch and Richard Reti came out in the 1920s and 30s, and they had a new school of thought, which is that black will go ahead, or I guess even white in some cases, will go ahead and allow their opponent to build up a strong pawn center, and then they're going to attack it later with their pieces. So that's the point of, we got the bishop and the knight over here. So not too much about that. D5 is the marker of the Grunfeld. It immediately just comes out kind of risky and says you are not putting a pawn here on e4. There's a lot more in depth to it, but I'm not going to go into all that. If you want, you can look it up on your own. White plays queen to b3. This is supposedly known as the Russian system against the Grunfeld defense. Fischer goes ahead and he plays d takes c4. And that's just that's clearly the best move, just because even though he's moving a pawn again from where he was, he needs to knock this queen out of the way as well as have an opportunity to win a pawn. So even though he's lost his own pawn in the center, that's the purpose of that move. Byrne takes back, queen takes c4, and now Fischer plays c6, just kind of blocking off this square if he can, also kind of helping continue his development in a little bit. So now Byrne goes ahead and plays e4, so he's got this very big pawn center. He's got a lot of pieces working together. One thing to note, the one thing he hasn't done yet, is he hasn't got this bishop out right here, and therefore he cannot castle kingside like he wants to. Now obviously he could castle queenside, but that'd be kind of a mistake just because this is where a lot of the openness is. He wants to get his king protected, and he's got these 3 pawns here that are good to do that. Okay, so then Fischer plays the knight on the b file here over to d7. Okay, so white plays rook to d1. He wants to get his rook on this file. He knows that a lot of stuff might happen in the future here between these 2 pawns on this square, and he wants to have his rook there for an open file. If no other pieces would move after those pawns are gone, then this knight would then be pinned to the queen. That'd be good for white. So then we got knight to b6. Once again, normally a principle is that you try not to move piece twice in a row, and we'll see that a little bit later here. But the purpose behind this is that he's just trying to harass the queen here, get it off of this really nice square that it's on. Now, Byrne plays queen to c5, which is a way of getting it out of the immediate danger of the knight. But it's a little bit awkward. I think Byrne maybe underestimated Fischer here just because he was a teenager. You'll see in another move here in a little bit, he starts to really press forward, and I think he tries to initiate a little bit of an aggressive attack when it's not exactly called for. So he's pushing these pieces ahead perhaps a little earlier, because I think he might have underestimated Fischer a little bit. He might have thought, well, I'm going to put a lot of pressure on this little teenager and he's going to crumble. That's not what happened. So we have bishop to g4 is next. So this is what Fischer decides to do. Just a little pin here on the knight for the rook. Mostly it's helping also just get the black bishop out. So Bobby Fischer, for the most part, has pretty much completed his development. I guess if anything, you could say that he could move this queen up and out here to connect the rooks. But White had the early development lead, you could say, but he's still playing these moves where he's not getting this bishop out here. This is, and he probably should have done it on this very move right here. The move that most grandmasters say he should have done on White's next move is move this bishop here over to here to e2, and that would just help remove the pin. So now if the knight moved out of the way, both bishops are attacking each other, they could maybe trade off pieces, and also it would allow White to castle right away, get his king to safety. Instead, Byrne decides to play bishop to g5, just like I was talking earlier. He tries to move these pieces forward and be a little bit aggressive, perhaps hoping to shake Fischer a little bit. I'm not exactly sure, but it didn't really work out for him. In fact, a lot of analysts of this game say that this move right here was actually the losing move of the game. It seems sort of innocuous, but supposedly that's what happened. Now, right here is where Fischer plays a really, really smart move. A lot of commentators after the game include this with the famous move that comes later as just as equally amazing. So right now, what can he do? Okay, what has Black got going for him? Doesn't seem like there's a lot going on, like there's any sort of super activity. What Fischer came up with is knight to a4, which seems like a really weird move at first glance, because all you're doing supposedly is hanging this knight so that this knight can come and take it. So I'm not going to go over a whole bunch of variations in this game. That's something that if you choose, you can read up more on it and go into on your own. But here's the idea behind this principle. Bobby Fischer sees right now that this king is not in safety yet. It's still out in the middle of the board. Remember, White did not move his bishop out here to help complete his development. So right away, the idea behind what he's doing is that he's willing to sacrifice this knight here to get this one defender of this pawn in the middle that's blocking this file. He's trying to get this knight away from defending that so that he can come in and get it. Okay. So I will go over just a few small variations that could happen. If knight takes a4 here, as expected, then what Fischer's going to do is he's going to play knight takes e4 right there. So it's a pawn for a knight, but watch what happens next. The next choices that Byrne could possibly have, he could maybe play queen takes e7. If he does that, Fischer is going to come in and play queen to a5, check. Okay. Then after that, he's going to be in some serious problems because he's not going to have anywhere for his king to go. Okay, he can put some stuff in to maybe block it, but his position's going to go south right away. Okay, so then another option here that seems like an obvious move would be play bishop takes e7 instead of the queen. Okay, but now we would have knight takes c5. So dropping the queen there. Okay, now they could respond with bishop takes d8, obviously. However, after that, we're going to have knight takes a4. After knight takes a4, we're going to have the bishop returning back here to g5 because it's attacked by the rooks. Okay, then bishop takes f3. Look at white's position collapsing here. Even if g takes f3, so after that, the knight is then going to take on b2. Okay, so now Bobby Fischer, if you notice, if you count, he now has an extra pawn after taking this one down here. And not only that, look at this openness all around the king. The king can't castle, even if he wanted to. He'd have all this going on. You know, it's not looking good for white. Okay, so we're going to look real quickly at another thing that would happen here if the knight took on a4. So once again, Fischer would respond with knight takes e4. That's clearly the best move. That's the point of what he's doing. So we've already seen that the queen taking this pawn is bad. The bishop taking this pawn is not very good for white. What instead if he just moved the queen out of harm's way from the knight here? Takes it back to queen c1. Well, once again, black is just going to play queen a5 check right here. So he would then have to respond with blocking it somehow. One way to do that here would be knight to c3. Then you're going to have bishop takes f3 over here. Okay, after bishop takes f3, all that you can take back with is this pawn over here. Once again, look what's happening over in here. Okay, so after the g pawn takes on f3, then you're going to have knight takes g5, which is this one right here. Okay, so now he gets back the sacrifice piece, the knight that's over there, that was on a5. And not only that, he's got a better position, and he's got an extra pawn. This is not a good situation here for white. Okay, so what can white do here? It looked like taking with the knight was the obvious play, but Byrne was smart enough to see all the variations that we went through and realize that was going to be bad for him. So what can he do? He can't just leave his queen there, otherwise the knight's just going to take the queen. Okay, so he found what was probably the best variation in this move here. He moved his queen over here to a3. Okay, so now the queen is not in check here, but the queen is still on this diagonal that he likes. And also, you know, if the knight gets taken, you know, he can get it back with either the pawn here, or if he chose, he could do it with the queen. Okay. So Fischer goes ahead and he takes the knight here on c3. Okay, once again, he's getting another attacker on this pawn over here. Okay, so white's going to have to take back. He can't leave the knight there. Okay, so he decides to take back with his pawn here on. Okay, so that's b takes c3 coming back. So now it looks like he's kind of got his strong center again. Okay, this pawn's helping support over here. You know, he's still got this guy going on. The problem is this is still a weak point here. All right, Bobby's going to keep attacking it. Okay, does it right away. He plays knight takes e4. Okay, so now his whole purpose here as black is now come to fruition because he's going to bust open this file here on the king. He's going to come in and attack this guy. All stemming back from him not getting this bishop out and being able to castle. Okay? So now Byrne goes ahead and plays. Bishop takes e7. He says, all right, you're going to give me the option here to either take the rook or the queen. I'll go ahead and do something, maybe I can stave off some of this activity you have going on over here. So Fischer has to move one of these pieces, otherwise he's just going to lose something for nothing in this situation. So he brings his queen out here to b6. Okay. So now finally, white brings his bishop out. He brings it out up here to c4, which seems like a natural developing square for the bishop. He's got an open line here. Looks like it's a pretty smart move. Okay. Along with that, we still got an attack on the rook over here. The rook hasn't moved. So Byrne got another pawn here. He's thinking that he's got a good game going on. Watch what happens here. Fischer decides to play knight takes this pawn here on c3. Okay. Now, what's going on here? That seems, once again, perhaps a little strange, because the knight can be taken by the queen, right? The problem is that right away, if this queen takes here, okay, then black's going to play his rook over here to e8. And now this is a really, really bad pin going on here with this bishop. Okay, and the queen is no longer in a position to help out on this diagonal with this bishop. Okay, so right away he's going to lose this bishop with check if he doesn't watch out. It's not a good situation. Okay, so what happens instead? Well, Byrne doesn't want to take this rook right away, because then Fischer has these rooks connected. He's just going to bring the other rook over with this check on the king. That's not good for him at all. Okay, so Byrne thinks that he's going to be clever, and he decides to keep the attack on this rook down here while also attacking Fischer's queen. He plays this bishop back to c5. So now the bishop is attacking both the queen and the rook along with this queen down here. Okay. So, what's Fischer going to do? Well, first he does a little in-between move here. He goes ahead and moves this rook over here to e8, and it's giving check on the king. Okay. So the point of that is not just to be annoying. It's not just to get the rook out of the way. It is to forcibly prevent white from being able to castle. Okay. So now the king, if he doesn't want to lose material, has to move over here to f1. Okay? So, white thinks that he's in a good position right now. Okay? He is threatening the queen over here. Okay? The rook has been brought into play, but the queen, or the king that is, seems to be safe down here. Okay? So, Bobby's got a real problem. All right, black's got a problem right here, supposedly. It looks like white just has a little bit more material and his position is consolidated. Okay. A lot of masters at the time watching this game, supposedly, that were observing, considered that black was just in a losing position at this point. But what actually happened next is that Bobby Fischer played one of the most famous chess moves of all time. It's not what seems like the most obvious move at the time. It has nothing to do with moving this queen, which seemed like a lot of people, masters and amateurs alike, would immediately try to move this queen out of harm's way and just be in a slightly worse game. Okay. What Bobby Fischer does instead is he plays bishop to e6. Now, what is going on here? If you look at it, it doesn't seem like that possibly helps solve anything that's going on right now. All it's literally doing is moving this bishop back here to attack this bishop. Okay? Looks like this queen's just still going to be taken. He's going to be down a whole queen. He's got nothing going for him, right? Donald Byrne, as white, went ahead and said, all right, going to take the queen. Here on b6, let's see what you've got in mind. Okay, so Fischer starts his plan in motion. Watch what's going to happen with the white king right here. This was the plan the whole time with allowing the queen to be sacrificed. Okay, black plays bishop takes c4. Check. Okay, king has to move to g1 here. Can't come to this e file here, remember, because the rook's looking down. King has to go to g1. Knight to e2, check. King has to move again, back to f1. No other place to go. Knight takes d4. Discovered check with the bishop again, now that the knight's out of the way. King has to move back to g1. Knight to e2 check again. King has to move back to f1. Knight to c3 check. King to g1. And now, before Fischer takes the rook right here, he plays a little in-between move. Doesn't just set up another check. He plays a pawn takes b3. Along with that, there is now a discovered attack with the rook on the white queen. So now white has to move his queen again. He decides to play queen to b4. Now Fischer plays rook to a4. Okay, so let's look at what's going on right now in this game real quick here, okay? This bishop on g7 is protecting this knight on c3 that has caused all these problems down here for white. Okay? Now the knight on c3 is protecting the rook on a4, which in turn is indirectly protecting this bishop on c4. Queen can't just come and take the bishop because the rook will just take back. White decides to move his queen out of the way while at the same time getting a little bit back. He plays queen takes b6. Okay. But notice something else that's going on in white's position. Remember how we just went over how all of black's pieces are coordinated and working together? White's queen's all the way over here with no helpers. You got rook and a knight over here. It's very disorganized as opposed to black's pieces, which are all organized and coordinated, working together. Okay? So now, after this little sortie over here, Fischer goes ahead and plays with his knight taking the rook on d1. Okay? So Bobby Fischer has a rook, two bishops, and a pawn for his sacrifice queen. Okay? This is, white's queen is very much overmatched on its own versus the combination of slightly lesser pieces that black has working right now. Okay, now I said I wasn't going to get too deep into a lot of complications in this game. There's a reason it's one of the most famous games of all time, is because it's very complicated. There's a lot of things that could have been going on that you could have seen. But I will go over this one thing right here. Let's say that Byrne declined the queen sacrifice. And instead, he just went ahead and played bishop takes e6 here, on that direct attack on his bishop. What would have happened then? Black would have played queen b5 check. Okay, there's nowhere else for the king to go except for g1. Now he could have played knight to e2, another check on the king. So now he'd have to move back over here to f1. Okay. Then we get another check on g3. White can't take back with the pawn because there's also a check here with the queen. It's a double check. He has to move the king. He's going to move it back to g1. And now Fischer would be able to play queen to f1 check. After rook takes f1, knight back to e2 is checkmate. The king is in check with the knight, and there is nowhere he can move, and there's no pieces that can take the knight. So the game would actually be over with what is called a smothered mate. Okay, everybody, so unfortunately, due to time constraints, we are not going to be able to show the entire rest of the game. The game did go on to checkmate. Bobby Fischer was able to mop up quite nicely. Byrne graciously allowed him to finish out the game, even though he could have just resigned after the last queen move that we saw. So in the aftermath of this game, Hans Kamak, who was a chess journalist, labeled it the game of the century in his magazine he was writing for. People like to debate that nowadays, but I think it's an acceptable moniker considering that it was a 13-year-old boy being able to defeat top master of chess in the United States using some brilliant combination and tactical play, pouncing on just what seemed like a minor mistake or two and able to completely dominate the game. After the game, supposedly, the leader of the Soviet School of Chess, Mikhail Botvinnik, said the phrase, "We need to keep an eye on this boy," which was actually kind of high praise from him because Botvinnik did not think very highly of American chess. And later on, obviously, Bobby Fischer ended up defeating some of the top Soviet chess grandmasters to become the world chess champion in 1972. So I hope you enjoyed this game a lot. If you want to see more of it, there are other articles written about it and other videos on YouTube. But I hope you understand some of the main points of this game, which showcases how you need to think deeply to be able to see different tactical and combination moves that you can play. And it doesn't matter what your age is, you can do it if you look hard enough. So I hope you enjoyed and see you on the next episode.